Hello and welcome to the Controller Chronicles HD. In this installment, I want to focus on a controller that is rather unusual and unique and really deserves its own focus. Now, longtime subscribers might remember quite some time ago that I did on Attack of the Famiclones a review of the Famulator, a Japan-only Famiclone that was rather unique because it was super tiny and had these really unique controllers, and in this installment I'm going to be talking about those controllers. Now, if you're familiar with the NES, you're of course familiar with this controller, the NES 004. This thing is typically called either the rectangle or just the standard controller. This thing is, I don't know, it's kind of adaptation of the Famiclone, or the Famicom's original controller, with its square design where the corners sort of dig into your palms when you hold it, making it not so comfortable, but it's iconic, right? Personally, I prefer to use the NES 101 controller, which was this one right here. The NES 101 controller is typically called the dog bone for obvious reasons, and I think this controller is just a better controller overall. It has a more ergonomic shape that fits your hands very well. The B and A buttons are sort of on a slight slant, sort of like the Super Nintendo controller is, and doing it this way makes games where you have to rapidly press the B button or A button very, very ergonomic and easy to play. As well, it has a very good D-pad. The D-pad on the NES Dogbone, the NES 101 controller, is about the best D-pad I've ever used. Now, if you're looking for one of these controllers, make sure you buy one that has the Nintendo logo. If it doesn't have the Nintendo logo, it's one of the modern-day knockoffs. And the modern-day knockoffs are terrible. The build quality in them is just some of the worst controllers I've ever used. So, yeah, don't buy those, even if you see them for like a good price, because they're just you're throwing away your money. Save up and buy one of these officially licensed Nintendo controllers from the late NES era, because these controllers are fairly uncommon, but once you get one, you'll never want to go back to the NES square controller. However, there is an alternative to this controller if you happen to like this iconic design, and that is the Famulator controller. The Famulator controller is this thing right here. Now, immediately what you might notice about these controllers is that the Famulator controller is quite a bit smaller. It's not only about, it's about 3/4 the length, but here's the kicker, the width. If you look at this and then compare it to an older controller, you'll notice that it's like without this back piece completely missing. This is very, very small, and being so small that you might think that, well, it would be hard to use, right? Well, actually not at all. This controller is a very well-designed controller, especially for a Famiclone, and that's why I think this controller really deserves its own focus. Now, one thing about this controller is that it has the B and A buttons above the B and A buttons, and these are basically your turbo buttons. These are Turbo B and Turbo A. It's labeled on the controller itself, the BB button and AA button. And then you have your start and select buttons, and of course your D-pad. Now, the thing about this controller is not only is it super thin and super small, but also the buttons don't have much range in them when you press them down. This really reminds me of the Game Boy Advance SP. If you ever used one of those, the D-pad and the buttons really feel extremely similar to that. And as someone who really, really likes the Game Boy Advance SP, I still think it's one of the best consoles Nintendo has ever made, and it's still a strong candidate in my mind for best handheld that they've ever produced. And that includes, things like the DS Lite and the 3DS and anything else. I really like the GBA SP. So, likewise, I really, really like this controller. The D-pad is it's slightly sloped. I don't know if you can really tell that, but the middle of it is sort of indented, where you can press your thumb in and have very easy access to each of the four directional arrows, as well as the buttons and the start and select. So using this for NES games is just fantastic. Now, the only problem about this controller is that it's DB9, and that means that it uses the Famiclone common standard used in Asia, which is this port right here, the same as a Sega Genesis. However, this will not work on a Sega Genesis, and that's because this is still using the 4021 control chip used in any standard NES controller, such as the official one. This use basically the exact same control chip, except this one uses an actual chip, and this one uses a glob top because, you know, China, and she produced so cheaply. But even so, you can simply take these apart and replace the cord with a standard NES cord. You have to know what the wiring is for that, and it's not super hard to figure out because there's only 5 wires, right? Even though it looks like there's more than that, there's 9 plugs here. Only 5 of them are actually used, and it's just a typical NES controller design. Now, if you have any other clone, such as the Gen X here, which is another DB9 based Famiclone, you can simply use the Famulator controller with that, or if you want, you could build an adapter for this by having a male DB9 and a male or a female NES port. And to do that, you'd have to scrounge around some spare parts and have an NES extension cord and cut that in half. You could do it, but you know, for me, it's just easier to just use an actual clone that has the DB9 standard built right into it. So with all that said, I'm going to be demoing a bit of gameplay using this controller. So first thing we're going to do here is, whoops, that's upside down. Plug that in, and we're going to be showing off a game. The game that I'm going to be demoing here is one of my very favorites, and I've talked about this before, and that is the Rock Band Super 6-in-1. Now, Rock Band Super 6-in-1, in case you've never watched my previous video on this, is all 6 Mega Man games, or Rock Band games as they're known in Japan, in one cartridge. This is a pirated copy of the game that was produced in China, or, you know, similar nations like that, and comes in a Famicom version right here. Now, because I like this game just so much, I didn't want to wear out the pins for the Famicom part of it. So what I did was I simply bought a Gyromite adapter cartridge, took out Gyromite, took this open, put in the cart into the NES port, and now what get plugged into the controller pins at the bottom are the Gyromite pins, or the adapter pins. It's not actually the cartridge itself. So this means that the cartridge itself has no wear ever, so it will last for a long, long time. So hooray for that. So all that said, let's plug this in and play some of this. Turn that on. And now I gotta move the camera. So, I'm gonna grab the controller here. So once again, super thin controller. If you look at its back, it says Cyber Gadget. CYFMLTRE, made in China. So I guess that's some sort of, I don't know what that means. Anyway, it's the Famulator controller. Ooh. Alright, we're going to play some Rock Band 6. Here we go. And here we go. Rock Band Super 6-in-1, Rock Band 6. Now, I could have put any of the Mega Man games, but Rock Band 6 is the one that, generally speaking, doesn't get the attention it really deserves because, you know, nobody played NES games by 1993. Alright. I'll go with Plant Man. Now, using the controller is very standard as a typical NES controller, but again, it has the Turbo A and B buttons, so there's the Turbo A button and the Turbo B button. The Turbo is about 8 shots per second, so it's not super fast. I mean, it could have gone up to like 16 shots. That's as fast as the NES can register. But still, about 8 shots is about what the average person's capabilities are by just mashing a button. You can do about 8 shots per second. And it's enough to, you know, get through most games. Now, I just find this extremely interesting how this is a clone controller that I actually prefer to use over an official controller. And that's because this thing is so well built and it's ergonomic in the hand. Unlike the NES 004, the square controller, or the rectangle controller I should say, this has sort of angled edges which make it very comfortable to hold, and also because the controller is so thin, it doesn't weigh anything, and even though it doesn't weigh anything, it still has a good build quality to it, and these are things that you just don't find in clone controllers. Typically they're built very poorly and they feel bad and their buttons don't feel any good. I have to be honest here, I still do prefer the NES 004 controller, or 001 controller I should say, which is, again, the dog bone. But, for a clone controller, I think this is better than using the original controller that came with the NES 001, that would be the toaster style NES. Alright, now let's take out Plant Man. Of course, Plant Man is super simple. He just jumps, throws his shield, jumps, throws his shield. Rinse and repeat. It's gotta be the easiest boss in Mega Man history, except for Toad Man, who will only attack you when you let him attack you. Otherwise, he'll just jump around. It almost feels like cheating to use the charge shot against him, so I won't. Bam! Yay, victory dance. Well, alright, that will about do it for this video, so thanks for watching, guys. If you have any questions about the Famulator controller, feel free to drop them in the comment section down below. Now again, you can only pick up this controller if you buy a Famulator, which is a Japanese-only Famiclone, or Famiclone, so, you want to make sure you hit up, I don't know, your import shops or possibly Amazon.jp. I think they might have some, but this was only sold in Japan, so if you want one, you have to buy this clone. The Famulator itself is not that great of a Famiclone, as if you watch my video, you already know that. But the controller itself is really quite good, and that's why, this video deserved its own showcase. So thanks for watching, guys. I'll see you guys next time.